The Building Brands podcast is dedicated to exploring the journeys of industry leaders who have successfully built a brand. Join me, Robert Royer, president of Building Brands Marketing, and an entrepreneur who has successfully scaled multiple brands as we dive deep into the strategies, challenges, and insights that have shaped the success of industry leaders and provide you with the resources you need to do the same. Building Brands Marketing is a full-service marketing agency specializing in crafting customized marketing strategies for service-based businesses with a creative powerhouse to drive real results. Welcome to the Building Brands Podcast. Welcome to the Legal Leaders series of the Building Brands Podcast. I'm excited today to introduce Casey Conklin, owner and attorney with the law offices of KCD Conklin, PLLC. Welcome, Casey.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, Casey, so kick us off. What inspired you to start your own firm straight out of law school? And how did your background in advertising and PR shape your approach to building your brand?
What inspired me was I needed work. I graduated. Yeah, I graduated law school. I passed the bar, and I had a 1-year-old at home, and I was interviewing for jobs that were offering me just barely more than what childcare would have cost me. So I decided just to start taking clients on my own, and it grew from there. And I started off rather quickly, getting a construction client right off the bat, and over the years, my background in PR and marketing, my undergrad degree from Michigan State's in advertising, and I tell people, I don't run a law firm. I run a marketing company that offers legal services. So, you can't run a business if you don't got clients. And so having that background, was a pretty natural step for me to go start getting clients.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. And that's a good background to start a law firm with, that's for sure. I know talking with you leading up to today's show, you've really kind of niched down into these key areas, and you've started implementing some of the steps of scalability over the last few years. Can you tell our listeners and viewers, when did you start the firm, Casey?
Yeah, so I got licensed in 2014, and I started it, the day after I got licensed. So it would have been May of 2014. So 11 years now.
11 years in. So you're working on estate planning, business planning, tax law. Did I miss anything there? Those are the key areas, right?
Yeah, those are the key areas. I try to focus to mainly transactional. I don't go to court unless absolutely necessary. I hire attorneys to go to court for my clients if need be. I do the transactional stuff, and then I'm licensed in the U.S. tax court because, business owners and estates, when they're coming to me talking about stuff, the first thing they always ask is, what's the tax implication? So yeah. I figured I'd put that in my wheelhouse as well.
Yeah. So how did you decide to concentrate on those practice areas, and how has that niche focus influenced your marketing at all over the last decade?
Yeah. So the reason I decided to get into those areas is because my first year, I was general as I can get. If you called me and said I have an issue, I was like, okay, I'm going to do that. I'll figure it out. And every time I ended up in court, I told myself I was never going back. And so I finally made the decision to narrow my focus and start sending clients away that were going to have me end up in court. And, what I learned was business and estates was the way to do that. And just so happened those were the two areas I liked best anyways.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. Well, Casey, so having the tax law, and being licensed in all 50 states, I'm assuming that's opened up some unique opportunities that local firms might not typically be able to tap into. Is that accurate?
Yeah, for sure. So, there's reciprocity amongst several states so for instance, I'm in Michigan. If I wanted to get licensed in, let's say, Indiana or Illinois, I could just file some paperwork and pay a fee, and they would say, okay, you're now licensed in these states. But there's several states, the most popular ones, so Florida, New York, California, Hawaii, that don't have reciprocity. So I wouldn't be able to get into those states as easily. So having that tax background and being licensed in the U.S. tax court allows me to practice tax law in those states, because that's a federal law, not a local law, not a state law. So for instance, if I have somebody in Florida who contacts me about an estate, I can say, yes, I can talk to you about the tax implications, the federal tax implications on your estate. And then what I'll do is I'll team up with a local attorney to do the non-tax law portions of it.
It's interesting. So talk to me about the marketing strategies that you've used over the past decade to scale the firm.
So, anything that's out there, I've tried pretty much in trying to figure out what works. Having the PR background, I knew, the basics anyway of what I needed to do. And so I was trying to find what avenues would get me there the best. Legal work is such a personal thing for people. So, even when people are coming to me with estates, I need to know, their family histories, their social security numbers, their bank account numbers, and how much is in them and all that.
Yeah.
And so with that type of stuff, there needs to be that trust built up with anybody that's gonna hire me. And so building trust is the avenues that I think work best. And the way to do that is the best way to do that is to have a personal referral. So, hey, I know Casey and he'll take care of you. And, at that point, the sale is almost complete. They call me and said, my uncle said you'll take care of us, so let's go. The other way is just educating people. People don't know what they don't know. And so any way I can get out there and educate people, which is why, things like coming on this podcast, people see my face out there and I'm trying to educate them in whatever area it might be. If they were to do a Google search or whatever and pop up and see, I've been talking about these issues, that builds at least that first layer of trust.
Yeah, I think that's such an important component to feature. Casey, it's interesting because with law firm businesses, I find that thought leadership and thought expertise component is sometimes undervalued, but it's more critical than some other industries. And in general, service-based businesses, the thought leadership component is more critical than retail businesses, by and large. And I think one of the afterthoughts that many law firms have is a lot of times they think of client acquisition as such a top of funnel problem of needing more awareness, capturing people that are in market right now for their services. And it becomes an afterthought of new client acquisition for law firms being more of a middle of funnel challenge more than anything. Because law firms generally, much like doctors, it starts out with a referral. A word of mouth referral is a lot of times how people initially stumble upon your brand. And then what happens is the consumer gets into the middle of the funnel and they start to look across the web for social proof, for trust, for expertise, and then they make their decision on whether that's the firm they want to contact or not, or maybe they do. This happens a lot with specialty doctors as well, and they can't get them in for 2-3 months. I know you don't practice family law, but in family law, that's a real challenge. If you're, going through a potential divorce or a custody situation and you contact a family law lawyer and they can't see you for 3 months for that initial consultation, what's the first thing that consumer does? They start going to Google and now they're going through blind referrals or something of that nature, right?
Yeah, that's exactly right. And you need to make sure, and that's why, nurturing relationships is actually really important, especially in the transactional world that I'm in, as opposed to litigation where it's more of a one and done. Hey, I'm not going to get hit by a car again, so I'm done with the services you provide me.
Yeah.
So there's that aspect, and I tell people, no matter, all my clients say, no matter what issue you have, feel free to call me, even if it's something I don't handle, because I will be able to refer you to somebody that I trust. And that
Yeah.
at least gets that ball rolling and building that network of attorneys. There's not an area of law right now that I can think of where I don't have an attorney that I personally know and trust to handle it.
Yeah, absolutely. I want to dive a little bit deeper into some of the webinars and workshops that you described. So, in performing some of those webinars and workshops, what have you found were some of the most beneficial takeaways to leave the audience with that has um, performed the best for you in terms of the effectiveness, whatever you would gauge that as,
Right.
of those workshops and webinars?
Yeah. So the biggest takeaway that I want for when I'm doing any of those webinars is for the audience to have that, maybe I do need that type of thought afterwards.
Mm-hmm.
So being in the transactional space, so especially with estate planning, I do mostly trust-based estate plans because that's what I believe is the most successful estate plan. I would say 70, 80, maybe even higher percent of the people out there assume that you have to be, Donald Trump to need a trust, right? If you don't have millions or
Yeah.
billions of dollars, you just need a will and you'll be fine, which, is not the case at all. I recommend trust to, like I said, over 90% of my clients based on that. And so when I'm doing those webinars, I want to get, the audience to the point to say, maybe I was wrong about that. I need to learn a little bit more.
Yeah, that's interesting. So I found with some of the webinars or workshops, the best thing I can do to get the most engagement is provide them some sort of exercise or template or something within that workshop. And when like, for example, it might be an AI prompt, it might be a template of some, and I'm just using my industry as an example, the marketing industry. It might be a template of a a marketing message template. It could be something like a CEO dashboard that has their North Star metrics that they should identify for their specific industry to be of use, something along those lines of a consultative tool or resource. And I found when I provide that, not only does it make them feel like they got more out of the course rather than some, templated PowerPoint that I just go through and then ask any questions at the end, but also a lot of times if they're beginning to implement that tool or resource and they're starting to think through the mental exercise of utilizing that resource, questions come up that they then ask me, and then it kind of reinforces my value as a thought leadership or expert in
Right.
this area because they realize, hey, I don't know this thing and you do, and then I'm able to further exhibit my expertise and creating a mutually beneficial conversation where we're creating,
Right.
a collaboration that's leading to useful output, and that reinforces the whole value of the workshop. Have you ever experienced that as well in some of yours?
Yeah, for sure. So, when I do estate planning workshops, especially in person, it's a lot easier to do them in person than on webinars. The webinar, it's so
Definitely.
impersonal. But, I usually have them fill out a worksheet that says, uh, I have children with special needs that I need to provide for, and I'll say, turn that stuff in at the end, and then you can reach out to me and I'll get all those questions answered. When you have that interaction, it builds that. It's kind of like I've already put some work into it. I might as well go a little further, type of
Yeah.
thing. And and not only that, I mean that's the benefit on my end, but on the audience end, it gets them thinking about these things. Well, I do have a daughter that has an addiction problem that maybe they need to be taken care of a little differently than my other children, type of thing. And if you don't get them thinking about that during your presentation, it's going to be lost on them. And by having, it's that muscle memory thing, right? By having them actually write something down or actually physically do something, it puts it more in their brain that we need to think about this.
Yeah, and I agree with you, Casey. I like the face-to-face workshops a lot better than the webinars or virtual ones for that reason as well, because you can kind of work the room a little bit as well. Hey, can people share, a couple things? You can call on people to share a couple things without getting too intrusive. So you better understand kind of the needs of the audience, so you can pivot a little bit on your messaging and exercise. I kind of going a different direction for a moment. I know you're at a really unique place in the firm. 11 years in, I know all service-based entities. That year 3 to year 6 can be a really pivotal time because it's where you sort of sometimes hit a wall, so to speak, and you have to sort of reassess your scalability moving into the future and what your next direction is. I've read several books that say at that point to continue to scale at the same pace that you have previously, if you're a regional based entity, requires an M&A opportunity, purchasing another firm, merging with another firm, things of that nature, to continue the same level of growth. Well, as you've scaled your firm and you're transitioning more to working on the business and not in the business, what challenges have you faced, Casey?
Yeah, so financial is always a challenge. When you get to that point to where it's time to grow, you realize that you're going to have to pay people to to grow. And
Yeah,
so you're watching your bottom line and saying, if I'm paying this attorney $100,000 a year, they better be bringing in $300,000 worth of billables.
yeah,
And that's never guaranteed, right? You don't have any idea outside of the interview process who you're hiring. Um, so that's the biggest thing, is getting over that financial hurdle. And that's funny you said that 3 to 6 years, because I hired my first employee at year 3. Um, in,
yeah,
in in 2017 is when I started hiring employees, and that's when I was at that point. It was either you either got to move forward and grow, or decide you're just gonna stay solo your entire career and figure out from there. And I decided to move forward and grow part. Um, because I knew early on that um, the legal work, although I'm good at it and I enjoy it, was not what I wanted to do forever. I wanted to manage the business. I like working with people. I like networking. I like running the business. So that
hmm
decision was easy for me at that point, because I already knew that that's what I wanted to do, and there was no way to do that unless I had somebody else doing the legal work for me. Um, uh, so getting the right people in the right seat. And I can't remember if we discussed this or not, but I'm a certified exit planning advisor as well, and I always tell my businesses, to get to where you want to go, you don't only you have to have the bus filled, but you have to make sure that everybody on the bus is in the right seat. If you have
yeah.
somebody who doesn't know directions running your navigation, you're going to be in trouble. And so that's the second biggest hurdle, I think, is figuring out who it is and where they need to be to help you grow and scale.
Yeah, absolutely. I've referenced this book several times on this show, but "What Got You Here Won't Get You There" by Marshall Goldsmith. He does a really good job about describing that. That's a, you touched on something. The problem is, hey, as you scale, you got to pay people, right? And that's a funky thing. And it was very difficult for me to swallow when we went from with building brands marketing, when we went from 10 to 20 employees, and I looked back at the net income at the end of the year on the P&L in that 2 year gap, and the net income was the same, even though I'm looking at the
Right.
growth of, hey, double the employees, the revenue growth on the top line, and I'm looking at the net and going, it's the same. And obviously you work a lot harder, not only to manage 20 employees compared to 10 employees,
Right.
but to manage that book of revenue, which, probably is twice the size if you have twice the staff. Uh, and that was a difficult pill for me to swallow, Casey, to
Yeah.
look at that and go, man, I really just feel like I ran through the briar patch and I made the same amount of net income at the end of the year. Is this really what I want to do?
Right.
And I'm assuming you've worked with a lot of business owners that they're at that stage where they're kind of contemplating, is this the right move or not, when they haven't quite been able to reap the fruits of their labor yet, right?
Yeah, for sure. And when you're going through and giving a business evaluation, those are things you take into account. If you can get the same amount of net income with half the employees, your business isn't as valuable as you think it is because you've got twice as many employees as you need.
Yep.
If you're looking to sell or to retire or whatever it is, those are things that people are going to look at. So when we dive into the business structures like that, those are the things we look at, and we say, hey, you've got this position that you're paying $60,000 a year. What are they providing for you? Because it needs to be at least, $200,000 worth of value to justify that $60,000 a year salary. And we through my exit planning training, they call it the ugly baby syndrome. Everybody thinks their baby is the prettiest, cutest baby ever until you start diving in and comparing it with other babies and all that.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so when you start looking at these businesses, you may think you have a $15 million business, but when we go in, you've got an $8 million business. You're just overpaying for a lot of different things. Your gross may be saying $15 million, but your net is saying, $2 million.
Yeah. Especially with service-based businesses, because service-based businesses, a lot of times, there's the owner has a direct contribution in the day-to-day operations, and so they create this inflated ego of what the business is really worth, where when you remove them from it, what you have to ask yourself the question, what is the real worth of the business? I love talking to people like you that are involved in the business law space, especially knowing you're a certified exit planner, because I've worked with hundreds of business owners over the years, and so many are not thinking about succession or what it looks like when they try to exit. We did not talk about this at all leading up to the show, but one of the things that I bang my head against the wall is when I talk to the business owners, well, just in general, when they're not thinking about what the future of their business looks like in terms of succession and passing on and exiting and so on and so forth. But B, the ones that push all of their personal expenses through the business and just completely diminish their bottom line. And I know 5 years, they may be, some of them that I talk to, 60 years old, 65 years old. And I know in 5 years, they're going to have to make a critical decision. And this, just eating off the bottom line of their net income is going to come back to bite them. Do you come across a lot of business owners in that situation? How do you handle that conversation? I know we're going outside of marketing for a second, but I'm curious.
Yeah, no, for sure. So the best way to handle it is to attack it early. It's like cancer. You find it early, you can fix it. The thing that we do with that is, so I tell my business owners, if you're thinking to sell, we need to start 3 to 5 years minimum before your sale date. If you show up to me and say, hey, I found a buyer for my company, I want to sell them, let's get this done within the year, I'm going to say, okay, you're probably missing out on 20, 30, 50% value that you should be getting. Because what we can do with stuff like that, so if you're running a lot of, quote unquote, personal expenses, they're not actual personal expenses because then you would get in trouble with the IRS. But, your company's paying for your car, paying for your internet at your home because you use a home office, all that stuff. What we do is we take that and we build that into the valuation, and we say, okay, listen, as the owner, I'm bringing home $250,000 a year, but I'm also getting an additional $100,000 in these perks from being the owner. And you can actually build that stuff into the valuation when you go to sell. Because when a potential buyer is looking to purchase a business, they don't want to just know this is how much the owner's earning. They want to know all the other stuff. And so if we can provide to them that additional, quote unquote, it's not income, but it's like income, right? Those additional perks, and we can prove that that's where these expenses are going. Because like you said, if you look at a bottom line and it says your business is, losing money every year, yet you're sitting on, money, you have money, you're not broke.
Yeah.
Right? But your tax filings and stuff show a negative. You have to be able to prove that. And we can, most of the time, be able to go through and prove that and show where those are and those various expenses. And we build it back into the valuation when we put it up on the market.
Yeah, and I assume that might also influence the whole formula for valuation you use. I see some people go off at seller discretionary earnings for reasons like that versus EBITDA and things of that nature. Yeah. I'm fascinated by this conversation. I love talking to people like you that are in this space every day. Well, any other advice, you would share with other law firms or business owners, Casey?
Well, in general, marketing is one of, if not the most important facet of any business. And it's funny when income goes down, the first thing people cut is marketing, and that's when you need to actually expand your marketing. Because they think they don't need it. And in those owners that look at that and say my marketing isn't needed because I don't have the money for it, whatever it might be. Those are owners I can look at and I say, okay, you don't follow your KPIs, because if your marketing, if you actually had your your key performance numbers on your marketing, you would know whether it's worth it or not. And if you're paying $5,000 to get $50,000 in revenue, that's a no-brainer. You would keep that. But when they cut that marketing, that's usually my first red flag. We should probably take a little deeper dive into your numbers and figure out where your marketing's working and not, instead of just cutting it. So that's the biggest thing with a lot of businesses is, marketing is not a secondary thing. That's primary. And that's why I say, I run a marketing firm that provides legal services, because without that marketing, nobody knows who I am or what I provide. So how am I going to get any clients?
Yeah, Casey, it couldn't be more spot on. It's why I teach that workshop, Scaling the Unscalable, that I talk about a lot of times on this show. And I provide a CEO dashboard where we try to identify those North Star metrics, because so many times, especially people with CPA or financial backgrounds, the first thing they do is start looking at the marketing to cut. And sometimes that makes sense. Sometimes it doesn't, if there's still a market demand currently. And so many times you look at, if the lead flow hasn't really dramatically decreased, but you're seeing a decrease in acquisitions, there's problems that are on the other side of the marketing bridge, whether it's sales team, weak closers, weak product that's deteriorated in terms of service, so on and so forth, that are the real underlying issue. And keeping track of those North Star metrics allow you to properly identify that, rather than just assume. I always cringe when business owners make business decisions based on emotional assumptions or intuitions. You know what I mean?
Yeah, for sure. And I tell people, we can cut your marketing, but we're not cutting your marketing budget. We can just move it around to the things that are working.
Exactly. Yeah, we can reallocate. Well, Casey, this has been a pleasure and a privilege. I've really enjoyed talking with you today. You're obviously very experienced in your space, and congrats to you on all your success. Where can our listeners and viewers find more about you and the law offices of KCD Conklin online?
Yeah, the easiest place is my website, kcdconklin.com, but you can also find me on, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, whatever, all those things.
Well, Casey, this has been a pleasure. Before I let you go, from a youth sports coach to another youth sports coach, we didn't talk about sports at all on here, but give it to us. So this year, this upcoming school year, what all sports are you going to be coaching? What age range? Just for our fellow sports enthusiasts.
Yeah, so I've been coaching basketball and baseball for several years now. My son has just started golf, so I'm probably going to be coaching that as well. So that'll be those main three. And then my daughter plays basketball as well. She also rides horses, but I know nothing about horses, so I can't coach her in that. So.
Well, I live in South Texas, and I know nothing about horses as well. That always shocks everybody. I just bought my first pair of boots in my life last year,
Nice.
And I've never worn a cowboy hat. So, no, I wanted to share that because it's always fun to learn more about people's personal interests and personalities, and that's all part of your personal brand, which is marketing. So, Casey, It's been a pleasure. Appreciate you being on the show.
Yeah, thanks for having me.